I really want to thank iForest for organizing this wonderful set of sessions. I'm sorry because of Parliament I couldn't attend the sessions this morning, but the one that I just heard was very informative, very illuminating, and I'm sure the day has been very illuminating for all of you as well. So, iForest, thank you very much for organizing this session. Obviously, I want to thank all of our distinguished panelists as well for adding their contributions. I want to recognize the media that is here today, and of course, ladies and gentlemen that are attending this session. As Chandabhushanji just said, when you talk about the just transition, you absolutely, everybody, no matter which perspective you come from, you have to talk about financing. And that's in fact a matter that I have been studying, not just for just transition, not just for the energy transition, but for the transition for the entire economy. And of course, we've been doing it for India, but we've also been doing it for many other countries in the global south. Because I think it's evident we have to move to net zero very quickly. And if we have to move to net zero very quickly, a lot of the challenges are in the global south, not in the global north. The global north has the capital, it has the technologies, and it has the institutional capacity to be able to get to net zero by mid-century. And in fact, on a legal basis, whether it's the EU Fit for 55, the UK Climate Change Bill, the New Zealand Climate Change Act, Australia has just passed theirs. Most of the major economies, including China, which have declared multiple times that they're going to get to net zero, you can be quite confident, I think, that the OECD countries and China are going to get to net zero by mid-century. So that we can be quite confident about. However, when we start to consider the global south, and I can tell you by 2050, the vast majority of carbon emissions are going to be from the global south. As of now, the just transition, the transformation of the entire economy to become a green net zero economy looks extremely challenging. And it looks challenging on multiple dimensions, and I'll come to those. But those are the same dimensions. Those are the same dimensions that relate to the just transition that we are talking about. But first, I want to address a point around financing just transition that was brought up in the previous panel. Several speakers on that panel said we should not be in a hurry. And I want to challenge that notion. We have to be in a hurry. But what does hurry mean? It doesn't mean next year, it doesn't mean 5 years, but it does mean the next 30 to 40 years, which in societal terms, in government terms, is like tomorrow. So this is like tomorrow, the urgency of now. It's the fierce urgency of now, as President Obama said, we have to act dramatically, quickly, and urgently if we have to get to net zero by 2070. And if we have to get to net zero by 2070, the first place we have to look, the most important aspect of this transition has to be the energy transition, and it has to be coal. Today, of India's 3.5 billion tons of carbon equivalent emissions, I don't know if this has been discussed, CB, but of the 3.5 billion tons of carbon equivalent emissions, 1 billion tons comes from thermal power plants. 1 billion tons. And as of now, the modeling has shown us that on the current course and speed that we are on right now, by 2050, we will reach 7 billion tons of carbon equivalent emissions. We will be at 7 billion tons. In fact, the UN modeling is showing us right now, even as the global north is going to net zero, the global south is going to continue to emit more and more carbon. Today, we are emitting somewhere between 55 to 60 billion tons of carbon equivalent emissions. By 2050, we will be between 40 to 50 billion tons. Under current course and speed, 40 to 50 billion tons. In 200 years, we have increased global average mean temperatures by 1.1, 1.2 degrees centigrade with 429 parts per million into the atmosphere. We are warming at such a rapid pace that the climatic impact is going to be catastrophic unless we act urgently. So the first point around the financing that has to be very clear to all of us. It has to be done urgently. It has to be done fast. That's the first point around financing. We don't have the luxury of decades. This has to happen in this decade. If we don't start to bend the curve on carbon emissions, we will not have a chance of getting it done by 2070. I'm not talking about 2050. I'm talking about 2070. So anybody who puts their head in the sand and says we should not be in a hurry is risking catastrophic climactic consequences. So we have to do it urgently. That's why the financing part is so important. So number one part about financing is the money has to be deployed very, very fast. Now, Chandrabhushanji and others have said just on the energy transition, their number is $900 billion. There have been various other calculations, but we are talking about $1 trillion over the next 30 years. $1 trillion over the next 30 years means incrementally we have to put 30, 40, $50 billion to work. Just as a point of comparison, the corporate sector capex in India today, just as a point of comparison, total corporate sector capex in India today is between 60 to $70 billion. So we are talking just in the energy transition of increasing corporate sector capex by 40, 50%. So this is immediately a very, very major, very rapid increase in financing in the just transition. These numbers are humongous. And right now, I'm just talking about it at the national level, at the economy level. I'll come very soon to the district level because I represent Hazaribagh parliamentary constituency. And just so you understand the numbers, Jharkhand produces about a third of India's coal, maybe 250 million tons. And Hazaribagh probably produces about, Hazaribagh constituency produces about 50 million tons a year. So I live this day-to-day reality in terms of coal production. So if we need trillions of dollars very, very fast, 30, 40, $50 billion a year at the national level, how much money do we have to put into a place like Hazaribagh and how quickly? We have to really think about that. The second point about the financing, the first point I said was urgency. The second point about financing I want to tell you is that the scale of what we have to do, trillions of dollars, 30, 40, $50 billion at the national level, hundreds of millions of dollars at the district level. The scale of it is enormous. We've never absorbed this kind of capital so fast, either at the national level or at the district level. It's not been done before. It's like running a 2-minute mile. You know, human beings run miles in 4 minutes. How about trying to do it in 2 minutes? Is that possible physically? So we have a very difficult set of challenges when we have to absorb this volume of capital this fast. So those are the first 2 points about financing. One, we got to move quickly. Two, the volume of capital that we have to absorb is dramatic. The third point about the financing is that we have a whole mix of different capital sources that we have to employ. Chandrabhushanji has just mentioned about grant capital, subsidies. We need, of course, investments, commercial, blended finance investments, return-seeking capital. We also have to substitute for government revenues, which some people touched upon earlier. So government is going to face a big loss of revenue. How are we going to deal with that? Government revenues also have to be considered. And then we also have to deal with the fact that we are going to have to rethink a whole host of subsidy programs that we have in place as well. So not only do we have to put in a lot of capital very, very fast, this has to go across multiple different sources of capital, subsidies, government revenues, philanthropic capital, grant capital, budgetary capital, all the various different types of capital sources have to be deployed, and they have to be deployed fast, as I said earlier. So that's the third point. Number one, very fast. Number two, huge volume. Number three, diverse arrays of capital as we think about these numbers. Then the fourth, and I'll dwell on this for just 2 minutes, but this is probably the most important aspect of it, is do we have the institutional capacity, the private sector capacity, the administrative capacity, the government capacity, the analytical capacity? Do we have that capacity to move so quickly across so many diverse sources of capital? We really have to think about it. And I can tell you, whether we look at it from a national perspective, whether we look at it from a state perspective, some colleagues from the state are here, or whether we look at it from a district panchayat perspective, we are finding it difficult to deal with the developmental tasks and the law and order day-to-day administrative issues that we have today in Jharkhand. Now suddenly we double, triple, quadruple what we are doing. Is that possible? So the practical realities of what we're talking about in terms of just transition has to be considered, it has to be evaluated, and we have to paint it in stark black and white terms, because unless we understand the speed, the scale, the diversity, and the institutional state capacity that's required to be able to do it, everything else we're going to talk about is going to be very academic and theoretical. So I'll conclude by saying we have no choice. We have no choice. The challenges are immense. But first and foremost, we have to build very quickly the institutional and administrative capacity to be able to deploy and utilize this capital effectively. Otherwise, and I say this as a former investor, the capital will not come, because why are anybody going to put good money after bad or outcomes that are not going to happen? So unless the capacity building happens, the capital is not going to come. We need to think of both together. Otherwise, we will not be able to achieve the goals that we have set ourselves to do. Thank you very much. Happy to take questions later.